This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Daniel O'Brien, K-State grain economist, and Guy Allen, the senior economist at the IGP Institute, begin today's show as they talk about the domestic and international grain market. In the first segment, the pair discusses corn and grain sorghum. Their conversation about soybeans and wheat keeps the show going as they continue their grain market discussion. Daniel and Guy also comment on macroeconomic topics. Ending the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with a weather recap and forecast. Chip says how we have recently been experiencing tropical moisture. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. Daniel, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Last week, our USDA WASDE report came out, and so wanting to give an update now from what we've seen from that report and the markets. And starting off with corn domestically, Daniel, what have we seen?
I'd contend that both domestically and probably on the international side too, that Guy will talk about, that the story on corn was the biggest one, followed of course by what we'd seen on the soybean supply demand balance sheet too. So domestically, that the surprise in this report was that the USDA, it wasn't a surprise, pardon me, that they lowered the yield some. People were expecting that from 188.8 in the August report down to 186.7 bushels per acre. Not a surprise, but what really was a surprise was the increase in corn production acres, 97,254,000 in earlier in the August estimate, now up to 98.7 million acres harvested, went from 88.7 to 90 some, and so an increase of about 1.5, just under 1.5 million acres planted, 1.35 harvested. And on a side note, I went back and checked out what the FSA Farm Service Agency reported acreages were, and they jumped to some degree, not quite as much as that. So, but when you look at historically, the Farm Service Agency, the World Ag Board, that comes up with the WASDE numbers, they look at historic relationships between what the FSA acres are, reported acres are, and where we finally end up at. So they made that call. So by the time the yields had come down, but the acres had gone up, we ended up actually with more corn production forecast, went from 16.74 billion bushels up to 16.8. So pretty strong increase, up about 72 million. And that combined with a increase in old crop stocks, about 20 million from the previous marketing year, ended up with a total of just about the same figures on ending stocks, basically 2.11 billion bushels of ending stocks projected. Exports had been forecast higher, up to 2.975 billion bushels. And Guy can speak to this in terms of what's happening internationally, but that 2.975 is strong record. And I don't doubt that right now we're set up, if we get these type of supply figures, to have pretty cheap, very affordable prices, and the possibility of U.S. dollar being supportive of exports. So that to me is a number that we'll be watching, Shelby, for the next several months of this market year, to see if we actually meet the pace of just under 3 billion bushels. We had a record year this last year, and as we were looking at the numbers, we had about 2.75 or thereabouts. But now we're looking at fully almost 200 million bushels more than that. So I'll be watching that. They left the price unchanged at $3.90 per bushel. That's for the marketing year. When looking at the futures, are what they're projecting right now domestically, they're actually, depending on what basis you put on things nationally, we're at about 420 to 440, something like that. So interesting. The USDA, no doubt, they're being judicious, being cautious. The $3.90 figure matches up their numbers. It's interesting to see what the futures have done. And the day of the report, the futures for corn, D's corn, closed up 10 and a quarter cents to $4.30, which was kind of counterintuitive. We weren't expecting with this, basically pretty much a neutral to bearish report that we'd see prices go up, but we did close at 430 that day, and since that time have been sort of up and down, but basically went to 430, and now we're just arguing up and down with regard to that. So, Guy, that's the domestic side. What did you see on the international side?
Yeah, I was sort of happy to see that new record for exports just squeak across the line here, which was good. In an international situation, the world production was dropped 2 million metric tons from August down to 1.287 billion metric tons. Ending stocks declined by a similar amount, 1.1 million metric tons to 281. That's still leaving us comfortable, but of all the commodities, corn's probably the tightest on that. On the Brazilian production, they added 3 million metric tons to Brazilian corn, putting it at 135 million metric tons. And this is the largest export that Brazil is going to have on corn there as well. But they're also increasing their feed and their ethanol usage domestically there in Brazil, which is a lot of that increase is being picked up by growing domestic consumption on that. Interesting thing, if we're talking about imports, China, they cut their corn imports by 1 million metric tons down to 3. Not too surprising there. I think China's days of being a big corn importer are waning, particularly as they're seeing increased domestic production there in China. And most of that China's growth in domestic production is they're starting to pick up some of this GMO advantage that we've seen in our production over the last 15, 20 years. EU corn was slashed 4.7 million tons to 58, although they did increase their exports a million metric tons to 23. Argentina and Brazil going forward, no changes in their numbers, 37 and 43 respectively. Russia was dropped a bit. A lot of interesting things going on in Russia, but it's just hard to get good information out of there. And it's got to be a bit of a growing concern economically in that whole Russia situation. Just one comment on the demand side. One thing we are seeing is increases in wheat feeding. I think outside the U.S., USDA increased wheat feeding 3.25 million metric tons to just under 80 million metric tons of wheat. So wheat's, we'll talk about that later, but it's still pretty cheap and pricing itself into the feed ration in places.
And moving on to grain sorghum, Daniel, what are we seeing domestically for that crop?
We did see an increase in yields slightly, about 1.4 bushels per acre for the U.S. estimate. That went along also with about a 40,000 acre increase in grain sorghum planted acres, and that's that same increase in harvested. So went from about 391 million bushels up to 402. And really, stand back and look at sorghum. The big issue for sorghum in this coming year has to do with the export figure. We ended up, after a lot of optimism early in this last market year, the one that ended August 31st, ended up with 95 million bushels of U.S. grain sorghum exports. Are projecting for the next one 225. So clearly, to do that, we're anticipating that will come to some type of a trade agreement with China, because they're the predominant world importer of grain sorghum, and that we'll get back on track to meet pretty strong levels. But absent that, then I think we're kind of paralyzed by the slow pace of sorghum exports. We'll use up grain sorghum eventually at a low price. It's going to be at a price locally where it'll pay to use it in very, very competitively with corn. But in the country, and Guy, you've probably seen this too. I think this happens overseas. If we have grain sorghum, because of the slow export pace that we didn't use up from last year, now we're going to have another strong crop coming, and that's a real real issue with regard to where sorghum's going. And Guy, I know both you and I have been looking at those markets and potential solutions. Do you have any comments on the sorghum side?
Well, the big challenge for sorghum is if you're going to get an end user, whether it's a feedlot or an ethanol plant or a poultry producer to switch over to sorghum, he's got to be able to stand out there, and he wants to buy a sufficient amount of quantity to justify changing that ration, just not bits and pieces. And at the moment, with lower prices and without really a lot of harvest pressure yet, we just haven't seen the volume coming there, and the price discovery has been a bit difficult over the last few months, particularly. So I think they'll switch, but it's going to have to get, I think, to a bit more of a discount, and the end users are going to want to buy volume sufficiently to justify his changes on that.
And that'll probably happen around harvest or shortly thereafter when you got the quantities right there.
Yeah, one comment I would like to make is on the carries with the big, record crop of corn and big crop of beans. Space is going to be tight all over, particularly in the western corn belt. Board spreads had sort of narrowed in a bit, but after the USDA report, they widened out a bit more. We're well over 50, closer to 60% of full financial carry. We're going to see everybody from the farmer to the country elevator, and I think even the end users will buy some fairly cheap grain, but that's keeping the basis values fairly cheap, particularly in the western corn belt where space is exceptionally tight. So the key thing on carries is the carries are there, and you'll get paid for carrying it, but you've got to lock in the carry. You got to lock in that forward price, and don't be afraid to try to negotiate that a bit.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by K-State's Daniel O'Brien and Guy Allen. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation with K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen, as they continue their grain market conversation. Picking up with soybeans domestically, Daniel, what are you seeing?
In that WASDE supply-demand balance sheet, not a lot of changes. A small increase in planted and harvested acres, by small about 210,000 acres for both of those. The yield figures cut down some. Small increase because of the acres and the production levels. Small increases, crush up some, about 15 million bushels. The export number down 20 million bushels. So the overall, the backwash of all that, the bottom line is that the ending stocks are just about unchanged. Ended up from 290 million bushels up to 300, and the price down 10 cents, 6.7%, stocks to 6.9. Really, the big issue domestically will be how we end up in the crop coming out of the field. You look at, I'm sure Chip Redmond talks about this. We'll talk about this probably, but you look at the drought maps. We've had some pretty dry weather in Missouri, Southern Illinois, in the central and eastern corn belt, and there's some question about how soybeans will finally finish up. It might be wonderful, but then again, it might not. So that uncertainty going on into the future, into the next crop production WASDE report on October the 9th, that'll be the question. But domestically, not a lot happening. If anything, that the weakness in exports that we've seen so far, a little bit weaker than had been hoped for, brought us down to 1.685, 1.7 billion bushels, and not of the strong pace you'd like to see. So we're just continuing this shift over to domestic crush and bioenergy that's kind of crowding out exports to a bit. Guy?
Yeah, looking at the global situation, no really production changes and not a lot of changes across the whole balance sheet this month. Just to highlight a couple things, ending stocks, they brought down nearly 1 million metric tons to 124 million. It's still quite loose of a situation. Chinese imports and crush also left unchanged at 112 million metric tons of imports and 108 million metric tons of crush. They sort of growing some of their ending stocks there. One thing that I did notice on the carry out stocks for Brazil, they increased those by another 500,000 metric tons. So we're about 8 million metric tons higher on that carry out than we were at the 1st of September than we were 2 years ago. That actually means that Brazilian export program is going to be moving later into the year, clear into November. So it's really hard to see any joy, or there's no reason for those exports to really shift back to North America yet. And as we talk about exports, Brasilia grows everything that they can, and they export it as fast as they can. It's just taking them a lot longer with their record production to empty that tank before they switch back to us. So it's hard to see any opportunity for any love for the soybean market here in the nearest buy situation.
So really, I think internationally will be. I think the ball will be in Brazil's court, South America's court in terms of the
Yeah.
planting season for these crops not too long down the road. And they'll be making those decisions with on the one hand low prices, on the other probably financial problems in a lot of these countries as we're battling out trade issues and whatever else and on currencies and interest rates. So just
Yeah.
thought provoking to see where that'll
On
go this fall.
on that, both in Brazil and in North America, even already, a lot of growers here are talking about going more corn or all corn even this coming spring. It's just the soybean situation is just really tough, and there's no quick fixes that on that relationship with China. They're always a very, very patient people, and I think in this situation, it's going to be there for their advantage not to get in a hurry. So it'll be interesting looking forward what we do with our corn bean planting relationship.
Yeah, and kind of the old developing wisdom is when will China enter the market to buy these commodities? Well, when we've just about given up hope that they ever will, and then
Yeah.
they buy very shrewdly. So just their revealed pattern.
Wanting to also talk about wheat today, did we really see any changes or movement when we look at the commodity?
The balance sheet, again, we saw, I guess, in that whole balance sheet wasn't a lot changed, except again, the USDA raised their expectation of exports for the next marketing year by 25 million, and all of it was hard red winter wheat. Now up to 325. So in June we were at 210 million bushels, 275 in July, August 300. Now we're 325. And when you look at the pace we've been at, it is pretty healthy. Here we're on a down week, really the last full week we had for September the 4th being reported at 4.7 million, and we were hoping to get 1.5 or 2 or 3 here up until of late. So that's a down week, and it's still way better than we've been having almost all that last market year until the very end. So, Guy, I just think maybe it's a case where the best cure for low prices makes us more affordable, and add that in with some uncertainty overseas about what's coming out of the Black Sea, and I guess right now has been working to our favor on the wheat export side.
Yeah, well, just a quick question before we move to world situation, Dan. Do you think we'll see more wheat planted this fall, given the poor situation for soybeans and particularly the lower cost of inputs for wheat?
Well, I think we have moisture, and if we put wheat in, wheat has an option to it. We can put it in, see how it comes, see what the markets are in the spring if they've moved around. There's the possibility of putting something else in next go around. You at least have your foot in the door on a crop planted. And we've got so much happening in the international realm that really no less volatility coming out of the Black Sea region with Russia and its uncertainties with regard to what they actually have for a crop, that I think people will probably we grow wheat in Kansas because of at least a couple reasons. One is that we're good at it, and it's our comparative advantage, and two, it fits in our rotations pretty well. So for those agronomic factors, I think we'll still plant a fair amount of wheat. It'll probably be sideways to lower as it has been for the last several years. Would that match up with your thoughts?
Well, my only thought on that is the thing with wheat is you can always turn cattle out on it and graze it. With these historically high prices for beef cattle, they start retaining a few heifers there. There's the feed. The biggest fear I think the cattle guy has at the moment is the beef prices dropping off. But turning to the global situation, look, world production was put in at 16 million metric tons. That's up 9 million metric tons from August, a big jump there. Again, that's a record world production of wheat. I don't know if the world needs more wheat. Maybe a few more places will start grazing it off for cattle. That said, looking at Australia, they were up 3.5 million metric tons, following the ABARE numbers at 34.5. Russian production came in at 85, up 1.5. And Ukraine production was increased 1 million tons to 23. That gives them combined production of just under 60 million metric tons. EU forecast increased to nearly 2 at 140 million metric tons, and Canadian production also up 1 million metric tons. So, with Chinese imports expected to be unchanged at 60, and world trade not real exciting there. It's been picking up a bit, but ending stocks are expected to be about 264 million metric tons. That giving us a stocks to use ratio of 32.4, I believe. So it's just hard to get excited about commodity prices across the board, I hate to say.
I would add in for wheat, really, that domestically, we'll have on September the 30th, the next stocks report and the small grains annual summary report. And really, on the production side, if there are any major surprises for U.S. wheat production across these classes, we'll get that out of that September report. At least that'll be our first shot at it. So, Guy, that's all I most of what I had to say. Do you want to bring it home with any final? Yeah. You got about a minute. Any final comments?
Yeah, just one bullish note. U.S. dollars dropping midweek here to some fairly lows, below 97. We're down to the lowest levels we've seen since early 2022. That should lend a bit of support. That said, ocean freight's firmer, up slightly, just above $2,100 on the index. So that's sort of what's happening internationally on those two indicators.
And the Fed came out, announcements today, the Fed came out and dropped their rates, gave strong hints that they're going to do it for another couple cuts. So cheaper, that comes at a good time if I've got my economics right for U.S. export shipments, and that we'd have a little bit cheaper dollar, little bit better trade prospects as people
at lower interest rates. So I've definitely seen some of our foreign exchange guys pick up a bit of their strength. So that should bode a bit well for exports and new purchases, new sales here coming up in the next few weeks.
Guy, Daniel, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen, and he was joined by K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien as they discussed the grain market. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we end our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, before the interview, you mentioned we've been having some tropical moisture, and what do you mean by that?
Well, just imagine you're in Florida and you've got really, really humid conditions every day. The temperature doesn't fall below about 60 degrees, and we have just opportunities of showers and storms every day. And that's been the theme for the most part across the state the last 7 days. When we think about the tropical moisture too, we don't talk about widespread sprawling complexes of storms that kind of cover the whole region. They're isolated heavy downpours, a lot of water where it does rain. And as a result, you end up with some folks with a lot of rain and a lot more folks with not a lot of rain. We've had some totals exceeding over an inch to even 2.5 inches in southwest Kansas in places. Those are some pretty big totals for the time of year. Our average precipitation is usually on the downward slide. And we don't see this kind of moisture this late in the year most often. And that's just that tropical air is pushed so far north. We're getting contributions from the East Pacific. Along Mexico, we had another tropical storm, Mario, that sent some moisture this way into the plains, and as well as the Gulf moisture streaming northward from the Gulf of Mexico. And those are combining and just keeping it really humid and allowing for these chances of showers and storms. Widespread precipitation has been limited, but almost everyone has seen some rainfall. The one exception, and really the driest area in the state, is the far eastern part of Kansas, where we've seen drought expand. We had abnormally dry expanded all along the Missouri border now, and we now have about 23% of the state is in some sort of drought category, and that's an increase of about 4% from last week, and it's still a decrease overall when we look at comparisons to about 3 to 6 months ago. But drought slowly starting to kind of reemerge as some of these areas miss a lot of these tropical downpours.
When we look at the forecast, are certain places going to be getting rain that need it and maybe some places drying out?
Yeah, the good news is over the last 24, 48 hours, the rain has definitely pushed further east than we've seen it for quite some time. And we've got that area of drought in Missouri and Arkansas that is expanded, is trying to expand eastward, but that's been mainly, that flash drought's been due to prominent high pressure that's kind of prohibited these systems from pushing that far east. The high pressure is weakened and is allowing this most recent system to push further east than previous ones. And another sign that, we starting to see some underlying tones of we're getting just the systems starting to move more west to easterly as we start to see a little bit more active of a jet stream. That also helps with some severe weather like we've seen in some places in the state again this week. And a sign that fall's starting to show its face. We're starting to see more movement in these systems. And as we kind of go into the next few weeks, I expect that to continue. We have more quick moving systems that are more pronounced, more cold front type features that are going to try to push this tropical moisture to the south and east. Unfortunately, it looks like every weak system we have come in with a little bit of cooler air and a little bit drier air, that tropical moisture just surges back northward again and comes right back. So we have periods of precipitation expected really for the next 7 days. And then after that, things start to look like they start to dry out. We have more of an impactful cold front expected by about next weekend at some point. It's still pretty far out. It looks like it's going to finally scour this moisture off into the Gulf of Mexico, hopefully. And maybe provide us a little bit more seasonal temperature, especially at those lows. We're still running about 10 degrees almost above normal right now with our lows. We've already offset that really cool start to September with the recent humid and warm conditions. So we need to see some signs of fall. I know folks are trying to get in the field and get some harvest going. They want the drier conditions, and hopefully we can get that last week of September.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.